Ladies and gentlemen, this is Rex and this is how Putin's invasion is changing our world forever by the channel Real Life Lore. Yeah, oh my god, it's a 35-minute video. Yeah. Obviously, Real Life Lore is a great channel to cover topics in very detail, right? All the logistics and things. So, in the current events are kind of, world changing. I don't know if most people realize that or not, but it is changing a lot of things, right? It's going forward, global economy, global trade and everything is going to get impacted in one way or another. Whole world's whole geopolitics is going to change, right? So I guess, obviously, 35-minute video, so Real Life Lore is going to go really deep into this one, so it's going to be fun. Let's watch it.
This video is made possible by CuriosityStream and Nebula. Watch another brand new, full-length companion video to this one in my ongoing Modern Conflict series that explains the entire course of Russia's prior devastating wars against Chechnya throughout the 1990s, along with further episodes covering the Russian invasion of Georgia and the entire war between Russia and Ukraine up until now. All of which you can access by signing up for the CuriosityStream Nebula bundle deal for less than $15 a year at curiositystream.com/reallifelore. In the early morning hours of the 24th of February 2022, after many months of military buildup along the borders, something that was previously unthinkable to nearly everyone actually happened. Within Ukraine, the morning everywhere erupted with the sound of cruise missiles and artillery barrages as the Russian armed forces initiated their full-scale invasion of the country, prompting the largest military conflict between two nation-states in Europe since the Second World War.
Clashes followed a campaign of aerial bombardment.
How can I find it?
This is just
bombings, too, at the other airports and military sites.
More than 200,000 Russian soldiers, along with their guns, tanks, trucks, and planes, surged across the Ukrainian border along 3 different fronts. And in the weeks since, the world as we knew it before has been forever and irreversibly changed in countless ways. As Vladimir Lenin once said over a century ago, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen.
Holy
While
shit.
the Russian invasion will certainly have numerous, enormous
This is just
consequences
fucked up.
that'll be felt by nearly every single country around the world, it's obvious that none will experience more severe consequences than Ukraine itself. Their country is the one being invaded, bombed, besieged, and destroyed as I'm speaking. And their country is the one whose very existence Vladimir Putin has now openly called into question. While the extent of the damage is unclear for the moment, after all, the dust has eventually settled, it will no doubt be horrendous. Ukraine will experience reverberations of this trauma for generations to come. And from the perspective of the Kremlin, the invasion is most likely not exactly going according to their initial plans. Putin and the Russian military—
That was somebody's home. This is just, this is unthinkable, man. We can never sit here in our homes and really process what's going on, what's happening to the people, or what they're feeling, and what they're experiencing. This is and especially this is in 2022, right? I mean, people who are involved there, right, with all the things that is happening, even they, right, in any nightmare wouldn't have imagined all this thing happening. And suddenly it happens. The shock of the event, right, first of all, is not going to sink in. Once it does, I mean, you're still not going to be prepared for something like this, right? Before World War II, World War I, there has been wars constantly, right? Somewhat here and there, like every few years, 1 or 2 decades at best, right? War over war, and people have experience with war, right? Around that time, it was like, not much of democracies, but more like kings and things were, so wars were kind of, somewhat common compared to this era, right? And now suddenly, after all this decade, way too many decades, suddenly a massive war breaks out. Yeah, the psychological scar of it is going to be really heavy.
clearly underestimated the ferocity of Ukrainian resistance, while they also placed too little of an emphasis on their own logistics and supply chains. The conflict is likely dragging on longer now than they initially anticipated, and that is a very dangerous situation, because with Western sanctions pouring in, the Russian military is in a race against the clock before they basically go bankrupt. And in order to try and force a surrender faster, they may begin utilizing even more of their destructive destructive and indiscriminate
Yeah,
firepower,
holy
like
shit, yeah.
concentrated artillery or air power, which they so far have largely been holding back. And when that happens, the destruction and refugee crisis, already the largest in Europe since the Second World War, will only continue getting worse. As it stands now, when I wrote this video, more than
I mean, let's be honest, modern weapons are way too deadly. There are certain modern weapons that is not known to public, right? Lots of different style of weapons with the modern technology that hasn't been used yet. But what if they use it? Because their back is against the wall with the sanctions and things. That thought is just horrifying, right? I mean, one day you just wake up and hear the news that this kind of tragic thing happened. It's like, holy shit.
2.5 million Ukrainians, mostly women and children, have been forced to flee the country as refugees, primarily towards the west in Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and Moldova. If the war ends up dragging into a protracted conflict, the UN has estimated that there could be as many as 10 million Ukrainian refugees fleeing westwards to the rest of Europe, which will be enormously catastrophic. To put these figures into some kind of perspective, during 2015, when Europe was undergoing the so-called migrant crisis from the Middle East and North Africa, the continent saw 1.3 million refugees coming in over the course of the entire year. There have now been nearly twice as many Ukrainian refugees as that in a matter of weeks, and it could be nearly 10 times as many. And at the same time as the refugees have been leaving, equipment, supplies, weapons, and thousands of foreign volunteers have been pouring in from dozens of countries across the world in order to help Ukraine's fight for survival. It's also worth remembering that we're only a few weeks into this conflict so far, and wars are often fought and won over the course of months or even years. It is still far too early to tell how this is all going to go. But should Putin's Russia manage to emerge victorious, it has the potential to completely upend the entire order of Europe. With the flurry of sanctions, travel bans, airspace restrictions, mass arrests within Russia, and more over the past few weeks, it truly appears that a new Iron Curtain is descending across the European continent. This time shifted over slightly to the east from where it was before, from Kaliningrad on the Baltic to the Ukrainian shores on the Black Sea. It is beginning to appear that the Cold War in Europe between the West and Moscow, once believed to have ended for good back in 1991 when people like Francis Fukuyama unilaterally declared the end of history, merely instead took a 30-year break and has now once again—
I don't know, this might be a too hopeful thing to think about, but once all this dust is settled, right? I mean, in the Soviets' time, it was a whole group of people that had different type of views and was, Soviet Union, right? Right now, it's just one man, right? I mean, I don't know what happens in the future, but I think, things are not going to be same as what it was during the Cold War time, right? Something will happen. I don't know. Because I'm pretty sure, there are many people, right, even in the Russia, who doesn't want this, right? People even who was in chain of command doesn't want this, right? So yeah, right now it's fucked up, but hopefully everything will resolve in the future. Well, at least that's what we are hoping. I mean, worst case scenario is really a worst case scenario for everyone, right? Yeah.
returned to haunt us all. The evidence of this is manifold and all around us. Historically neutral, recent polls in both Sweden and Finland have shown that the majority of the population in both countries is now in favor of joining the NATO alliance for the very first time. Both governments have expressed some form of interest, and Moscow has directly threatened them both with some kind of action should they dare to proceed. Of course, Finland's admittance into the alliance would be particularly controversial, owing to their large land border with Russia and their proximity with St. Petersburg, Russia's second largest city and the hometown of Vladimir Putin. For decades during what I will now always refer to as the Cold War's first phase, the Soviet Union essentially bullied Finland into always staying neutral between East and West. And it seems as if old habits die hard. But among the greatest of changes ushered in by Putin's war in Ukraine is the revolution undergoing Germany, and specifically the German military and defense doctrine. During an incredible session of the German Bundestag just 3 days after the invasion, the new Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced a series of earth-shattering measures. The German armed forces would receive a one-time $113 billion defense fund to rapidly modernize themselves, and from thereafter would receive a permanent annual budget increase to more than 2% of Germany's annual GDP. This means that their yearly budget will be increased to around $78 billion, causing Germany's military to suddenly become the third best funded in the world, only behind China and America. And critically, that means they'll be ahead of Russia's military budget. Very rapidly, the German army will likely once again, for the first time in nearly a century, take over the reins of being the most formidable on the European continent. And the geopolitical revolution goes even further beyond that. Germany has also agreed to send lethal aid to Ukraine, and most unexpectedly of all, they've even agreed to indefinitely suspend the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project that would have brought in even more enormous quantities of natural gas directly from the vast sources of Siberia and Russia. The cost to build this controversial pipeline was more than $11 billion, and so of course, such a move will be difficult for the German economy to bear. But such is their resolve in showing solidarity with Ukraine. This is all quite unexpected and unprecedented because
Germany will be fine, right? Germany has many income sources, right? It's automotive hub of the world. So yeah, it will hurt, but yeah, it won't collapse the German economy. That's why they're like, okay, we can weather this.
right up until the actual invasion, Germany was hesitant to actually support Ukraine and come out hard against Russia, because Germany is critically overdependent on Russian natural gas, even without the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. With limited domestic energy resources of their own, Germany has had no other choice but to import nearly the entirety of her energy needs from abroad. And with some of the largest natural gas and oil reserves in the world, geographically nearby Russia has always been the most significant provider, through a complex series of pipelines that have been constructed over decades sprawling out from the vast oil and gas fields in Siberia. Russia directly provides Germany with a third of her oil and half of her natural gas. And the same is true for much of the rest of Europe as well. Italy and France also import significant amounts of Russian fossil fuels, and the closer eastwards the countries are to Moscow, the more fossil fuels they generally import, to the point where many nations like Bosnia, North Macedonia, Moldova, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Croatia, Czechia, and Austria import nearly the entirety of their gas from Russia. This is largely because, geologically, the European continent was not blessed with large amounts of oil or natural gas that power the modern engines of civilization, and instead, large amounts of these resources can be found all around the European Union's perimeter, in the North Sea between the UK and Norway, across the Ural Mountains in Russian Siberia, in the eastern Mediterranean around Cyprus, Israel, and Egypt, and of course around the Persian Gulf.
It makes sense why lots of European countries like France went nuclear, right, to create energy, right? Now it kind of makes sense because it's they are really dependent on one country for the most of their resources. You know, there are not much of natural gas, oil from where they are, right? They have to import a lot of it. So, you know, that's why they try to be somewhat independent when it comes to energy. I guess, you know, a few years ago, Germany, stopped certain nuclear plants, closed them down to make more, I don't know, was it a oil power, coal? I don't know which, but they probably stopped, nuclear plants or something, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
Critically few oil and gas resources themselves. The European Union is therefore critically addicted to the imports of Russian oil and gas flowing in from their pipelines, and it severely limits their abilities to actually confront Moscow's aggression. To overcome this dependency and energy insecurity, the European Commission has, since the invasion, outlined a 10-point proposal to make the EU completely independent from Russian fossil fuels by the end of the decade. But of course, that is going to take years to accomplish, and until it happens, every drop of oil and gas that Europe continues to buy from Russia will go directly towards funding the Russian war machine in Ukraine. The problem, though, is that there aren't really any easy alternatives for Europe to choose. Norway, the second largest provider of gas to the European Union, is already at maximum export capacity through their own pipelines and cannot provide any more than they already are. In theory, the EU could replace some of Russia's gas with liquefied natural gas or LNG imports coming in on tanker ships from friendly countries like the United States, Qatar, or Australia. But there are many problems with this strategy as well. First, Europe lacks a lot of the infrastructure that's required for importing LNG. In order to do so, they need LNG processing terminals at ports that can take in the LNG from container ships, turn the liquid back into its gaseous state, and pump that into pipelines. Unfortunately, Europe has very few of these LNG terminals existing right now, with only a handful in Portugal, Spain, Italy, France, the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, and Greece, while major global economies like Germany, who import more than half of their gas from Russia, have zero. So in order to begin importing LNG at a large scale, the Germans will have to build brand new LNG terminals. But that is going to cost billions of dollars and take years to accomplish. Secondly, even if the EU had the infrastructure, the supply chain of LNG is already highly constrained as it is, and met by massive demand for it in Asian economies like China, South Korea, and Japan. If the EU suddenly began buying LNG at a large scale, then the price for everyone would increase dramatically. The EU could also rely a bit heavier on their own limited domestic sources of gas, but this too is highly problematic. The largest natural gas field within Europe, and one of the top 10 largest in the entire world, is right here, the Groningen field in the Netherlands. For decades, this field provided gas that powered much of the Netherlands and the rest of the continent, and in 2013, provided as much gas was extracted from it that flows through Nord Stream 1 towards Germany today. But the field's days are numbered. The extraction of gas from here caused wide-scale subsidence. That is, the sinking of ground beneath it.
Damn.
This phenomenon was further accompanied by significant earthquakes in the region of the northern Netherlands that damaged many houses and caused significant local unrest. Therefore, it was decided by the Dutch government nearly a decade ago to steadily phase the gas field out between 2014 and 2022, when production was supposed to halt entirely. But now, faced with the threat of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the dire need to get the continent off of Russia's gas supply, the Netherlands has decided to continue extraction in the field until as late as 2028, with unknown seismic.
Yeah, but that cannot last, right? I mean, if it causes real local problems, like massive earthquakes and things, Netherlands is not going to decide to help everybody in Europe while their own people are in danger, I guess. So this is just a temporary thing.
Consequences around Groningen and the northern Netherlands for the future. And there are precious few other alternatives for the European Union to make. In theory, new gas pipelines could be constructed into the continent from other sources like the gas fields around Israel and Cyprus in a proposed project called EastMed, or from the gas fields of Nigeria that would loop around the African continent towards Spain. But just like building out the LNG infrastructure, these projects will cost billions of dollars and take years to develop, and in the end, they'll each only substitute a fraction of the gas that Russia is capable of pumping into the continent. Meanwhile, and quite unlike Europe, the United States is tremendously geologically well endowed, with enormous quantities of domestic oil and gas resources across some of the world's largest fields in Texas, Alaska, North Dakota, and northern Pennsylvania. Thus, a full 65% of America's oil and gas supply is produced domestically within the country, and America has tremendously more energy security than Europe does as a result, and thus substantially more flexibility when it comes to dealing with Russia. Therefore, it was a much easier decision when President Joe Biden decided to ban the imports of Russian oil and gas into America, since Russian fuels were only providing less than 2% of the total US supply in the first place. America can easily replace the difference by
Yeah, see, this is one of the reasons why USA has been a powerhouse for a century now, over a century. Because where they're located is already way too advanced. I think RealLifeLore has made a video, like geographically where United States exists is how, powerful position. On top of all that, they don't have neighbors that are that threatening to them, right? And they have resources that they can extract where they live in their massive lands. So yeah, United States is basically going to be unfazed by all of this, right? Even if a world war breaks out somewhat, right? USA being where it is, not in Europe and things, it's still going to be somewhat secure compared to the other European countries, just like how it was in World War. But yeah, European countries being more dependent on one country for oil and gas, that is going to be a massive problem going forward. Because like he says, that you can't just create pipelines like that, which spans thousands of hundreds and depending on like that Africa one probably is thousands of miles, right? So when something is that long, right, have to curve around, it's gonna take a decade or something just to create, right? That kind of a massive project. It's not a joke. So how do you counter something like that right now? It's really hard, right? You can't just say no gas and no natural resources from Russia. Your economy is gonna collapse like that, because that's your half of the resources gone.
banning Russian imports, whereas Europe simply cannot. Of course, the Russians do realize that by this point, their lucrative days of selling fossil fuels to the West are rapidly coming to an end, and in anticipation, have been massively pivoting their supplies and business towards Asia, where many major economies like China, India, and Pakistan have still so far declined to join in on any serious sanctions against Russia. Right now, Europe remains Russia's largest customer of gas by far, since they import around 200 billion cubic meters from them per year. By comparison, right now, China only purchases around 38 billion cubic meters a year from Russia, which is primarily provided by the Power of Siberia pipeline here in the Russian Far East. However, in light of recent events, this will likely change very quickly. China has yet to become connected to the massive gas fields of northern Siberia that the Russians use to dump gas into Europe from. And under an agreement that is closer than ever now to fruition, a second pipeline called Power of Siberia 2 may be finally constructed from these very same fields directly to China's hungry industrial core around Beijing. That'll double Russia's gas exports to China. Unlike the West, China will likely continue without passing any serious financial sanctions on the Russians. And quite to the contrary, will even provide the Russian government with investments into new pipeline infrastructure that flows towards Beijing, like Power of Siberia 2. Because they want and need Russia's vast energy resources. And now that business in Europe is drying up, China senses an opportunity to make a good deal, while Russia sees the opportunity to simply shift business elsewhere. As a result, while the war in Ukraine is ripping apart all of the bonds between Europe and Russia, it also seems to be pushing Russia and China closer together from a financial and energy perspective. Over time, Russia may end up pivoting the entirety of its energy resources towards the emerging markets and economies of Asia. And from China's perspective, whatever happens in Ukraine might provide invaluable insights into how a potential future Chinese invasion of Taiwan might go. At the same time as all of this has been happening, another fascinating way that the world—
See, that's the thing. What was that Chinese diplomat, somebody basically said it's not an invasion, it's a special military exercise or whatever, right? What Russian official statement was, China repeated that. At that point I knew, like, okay, I guess this is the nobody wants to be first, right? I mean, China didn't want to be first, but now since Russia is first to doing this, China's like, I'm just following in the footsteps. It will be much easier now for the China. Yeah, that's just after part. Alright people, I have to go right now. I guess I'll do this in 2 parts. It's a way too big of a video. And anyway, if I make a 50-minute or so video, most people kind of, after 20-30 minutes, people starts to nod off or something. That's what the stats tell me. So yeah, I'll do this in 2 parts. Alright people, if you like my reaction, don't forget to like, subscribe, and yeah, I guess I'll see you next time.